Hi, all. This is William with the Death in Literature series on YouTube. I think we're up to number 6. I should have made sure that I had the number right before I started. So, as usual, I'm switching things up a little bit. Previously, we did, what did we do? We did Women in Love and Black Narcissus, both English language works, one from, they're both 20th century. And I was going to make the next topic the death of children, even though it's a horrible thing to contemplate. And instead, I've decided, yes, originally I was going to do The Plague, Jane Eyre, Lord of the Flies, and Turn of the Screw. But looking at those, I decided there's enough in common. Well, for one thing, I'm not going to get through 4 books. It's going to take me longer than I want to take. And the other thing is that Jane Eyre and The Turn of the Screw have more in common than the fact that children die in them, and more in common than The Plague and Lord of the Flies, which do have something in common with each other, because they deal with sort of a practical view of, not that they're lacking a further dimension, but more of a practical idea of how death comes to the children who die in those 2 books. In Jane Eyre and The Turn of the Screw, they're both books that have a little bit, well, in Jane Eyre just a little bit, but in The Turn of the Screw, very definitely a supernatural element. Well, supernatural and or psychological element. Jane Eyre is equated by her employer and future husband to one of the wee people, of fairy, or whatever name you would give to them. That there's something a little bit uncanny about her. And in The Turn of the Screw, well, that's a classic ghost story. So, the authors, Charlotte Bronte and Henry James, so one of them English, one of them Anglo-American, Henry James being Anglo-American. They're both 19th century works, although Henry James's The Turn of the Screw just barely makes the cutoff. It was, I believe, published in 1898. But I think it's more informed by the spirit of the 19th than the 20th century, I would say. You could argue me out of that idea, probably. So, in Jane Eyre, the child who dies does have kind of an extra spiritual dimension to her, but it is a natural death. And in The Turn of the Screw, we don't really know what happens, but it's really anything but natural. I don't think they did an autopsy, unfortunately, because wouldn't we all love to know what actually explains the death of Miles in The Turn of the Screw? Both of the books have young governesses who enter a household and just turn it upside down, whether for good or ill. And death sort of follows because of their entrance into these households, but in very different ways. And both books have wise old housekeepers that are sort of not really in opposition, but kind of, so the governesses are young women, the housekeepers are older women, and they have a different idea from these young women on what is proper in these households. Okay, so let's start with Jane Eyre. It's the longer book. The Turn of the Screw is a novella, and both books have multiple deaths in them. And when you think of Jane Eyre, you're probably not really thinking of the death of a child, but it's one of the deaths in literature that really stands out to me, because it is vivid and it's touching, Okay, so let's go on. Now, in both books, another thing that both books have in common is that the children in them are orphans. And that brings death into the narrative from the very beginning. So Jane Eyre, her parents are dead, and that's how she comes to be raised by an aunt who just not only doesn't want her, but is hostile to her very presence. Whereas in The Turn of the Screw, again, there's a close relative, an uncle, but again, he wants nothing to do with the children, just nothing to do with them. Okay, so we have to begin with the first death. After the acknowledged death of the parents is when Jane Eyre is sent off to boarding school, and it ends up later becoming a very nice, a very good boarding school. But while she's there, it's under the her first year's there, it's under the control of an absolute tyrant. And there's this little girl named Helen, and she's constantly tormented by her teachers and humiliated, deliberately humiliated by them. There's one teacher that always picks on her, and for instance will make her stand on a chair or wear a placard around her saying, that she's slovenly, that she's a slattern, and here she is, and she's just this little girl. And not only that, but she's dying. She has tuberculosis, which is, just ubiquitous in 19th century works, because it was ubiquitous in 19th century lives. So the little girl's name is Helen. Did I say that already? And she is the personal element of death in this book. There's also an impersonal element at Lowood School. There's a typhus outbreak. The girls are kept half starving and cold during the winter. When they get up to wash themselves, the water in their wash basins is frozen and nothing is heated. And so, they're physically vulnerable. Their immune systems are depressed. Typhus breaks out, and several of them die. But not Jane Eyre, and not her friend Helen. Helen does die of consumption, and she's the personal face of death in this school where girls really suffer. She is, despite her age, placed in what is called a crib in the room of the most compassionate of the teachers, and she's kept away from the other girls, not only because they have typhus, but because she's dying. She can no longer participate in activities, and the teacher wants her to have a peaceful death. And Jane, this is her best friend. Helen is her best friend, and she goes looking for Helen, and she goes into the teacher's room when the teacher's not there, and she finds Helen in her crib, literally on her deathbed. And she climbs into the crib and lies next to Helen, who asks her to stay. And at some point during the night, Helen dies. And when the teacher returns, she finds the two girls cuddled up to each other, and poor Helen is dead. And there is kind of a maudlin element to it. For one thing, Helen is very much the type of the angelic child in 19th century literature. You find the same in Oliver Twist as the angelic child, despite the fact that he's born and raised among the sort of most uncivilized and bullying adults and children. Despite that, he's always this refined little angel child. He doesn't die. Usually the angel child dies. But in the case of Helen, she does die, and from the beginning, we realize that she is a true Christian. She accepts the persecution of the teachers, and she is always at peace in her faith. She dies a peaceful death. She dies the death of the virtuous. And that notwithstanding, it isn't maudlin, it is a lovely scene. Okay, and TB itself, it had this sort of double image in the 19th century. It was seen as a disease of artists and very refined people. Uh, the flip side of that is that it was seen as a disease of the poor and the dirty, and also this idea that TB sufferers became extremely promiscuous and kind of sex crazed. But there's this other sort of metaphorical picture of the TB sufferer as the disease actually ennobling them and them being already refined and artistic type people. And so Helen certainly falls into that side of the metaphor. Okay. And it's not, I think I mentioned in the first episode that I had, after my mother died, and I spent some time talking to the priest at our Greek Orthodox church, and he emphasized that the only death that's, I said my mother had a grotesque death, and he emphasized that the only grotesque death is a death that comes when a person is alone. And Helen, in the end, is not alone because she has Jane with her. She's been abandoned by her parents. She's not an orphan. I think her mother's dead, but not her father. But she's sort of been abandoned, more or less, and sent to this boarding school where she's persecuted. But her death is not grotesque in the sense that she's not alone. And even if Jane hadn't been there, it's pretty clear that she would not have been alone anyway, because she was so connected through her faith and through her love that even if there had been nobody present in the room, it would not have been a death where she was isolated and alone in that sense. Okay, so the next death, well, Jane herself had a tormentor, and that tormentor was her cousin John Reed. And John Reed was not restrained at all by his mother, Mrs. Reed, the aunt who reluctantly takes Jane Eyre in when she's orphaned. And John Reed he's a bully, he's a nasty piece of work, and he ends up dying by his own hand, by suicide, because he's squandered his whole fortune, his whole inheritance that his mother gave him, some of it in advance. He's almost impoverished his mother. And finally, in the end, she says no when he's got, gambling debts or something that have to be paid right away. She finally says no, and he kills himself. So unlike Helen, John Reed is the type of someone who is an evil person who comes to a sticky end, sometimes suicide or something like spontaneous human combustion in the sense of Mr. Crook. And the loss of her beloved son John sends Mrs. Reed to her deathbed. I think she has a stroke or a series of strokes. And her children, John is dead, and her two daughters, who are not compassionate people, they don't want to linger at their mother's deathbed. So she's more or less abandoned by them, even though they still live in the household. They're not going to take care of her. They're not going to, they probably were also bullied by John, whose mother indulged him in every way, although that's not included in the book, that they were bullied by him. Anyway, they don't love their mother. They're not going to be at her side when she dies. She sends for Jane Eyre, not because she's in any way fond of her or wants Jane Eyre at her side, but because she has something on her conscience that she literally believes is going to send her to hell if she doesn't address it. So there's this absolutely grand scene in Jane Eyre, one of my favorite scenes in literature, where this little girl, Jane, I think she's 9 years old, when her aunt decides to send her away to boarding school, And rather than being upset by this, Jane is glad, and she confronts her aunt. And where does the gumption come from that this child has? It's rather heroic. Although later on she feels guilty about it. She confronts her aunt, and it's almost like the speech that Ahab gives in Moby Dick, where he's cursing the white whale, and from the depths of hell I spit at you, or something like that. I can't remember the exact words. And that's basically what this little girl says to her aunt, who's always tormented her. I will not visit you. I'll tell everyone what a wicked woman you are. And it's so effective that the aunt herself actually is taken aback and starts being a little nicer to her for the brief time that they have left together, because Jane Eyre scares her. And now that she's on her deathbed, the words that Jane Eyre spoke to her remain with her, that she was a wicked woman, that she treated this little girl cruelly, and she believes that she's going to go to hell for this. So she sends for Jane Eyre. She's tried in every way possible to sabotage Jane Eyre's life by withholding from her the knowledge that she has a rich uncle who wants to take care of her. And she just wants to see Jane Eyre ground into the dust, and so she sends to her for her. She tells her about the uncle. Her intention is to make her peace with Jane Eyre, maybe apologize to her, but even though she's dying, she can't do it. She can't do it, and she is in turn like Ahab, cursing Moby Dick. She curses Jane Eyre no matter what. She tells her about the uncle, but other than that, she goes to her death with this hatred of this child, because she can't forget that episode when Jane was 9. She sees hellfire on her deathbed, but not even that is enough for her to relent. So this is an example of death in bitterness and conflict. So again, like Moby Dick, with Ahab being absolutely embittered and willing to suffer the worst that he can suffer, as long as he takes the whale down with him. And the same with Mrs. Reed. So she dies of her sins, basically, of her sin in indulging her monster of a son, and in her sin of trying to ruin the life of her niece. So the next and most famous death in the book is of Mrs. Rochester, when Jane Eyre gets a job as a governess and goes to this rather remote manor house, and her boss is Mr. Rochester, and she thinks he is a bachelor. Everybody does. But he's got this violent and crazy, insane wife that he's keeping in the attic. And she thinks it's this other woman. She thinks there's this demented servant, Mrs. Poole. The mad woman gets loose one night and sets Mr. Rochester's bed on fire. And, so death and the potential for death and the threat of death are everywhere in Jane Eyre. And it turns out, of course, that Mrs. Rochester suffers from hereditary madness. There's some interesting speculation out there about what specific ailment she suffered from, and the one that fits a lot of her symptoms is Huntington's disease, which is also an inherited disease and causes a person's brain function to diminish. It doesn't, usually make them violent, but Mrs. Rochester, Bertha, is violent. And she has these weird jerky movements, but there's no single disease that explains all her symptoms or that fits in with all her symptoms. I just thought that was interesting. So she ends up falling off a rooftop. She sets the house on fire. I hope you know all of this. I always forget to say that the whole series is spoiler after spoiler. she plunges off the rooftop. Whether she jumps or whether she falls is unclear. I think she does jump. So we can't really moralize about her. Well, Mr. Rochester does. He says that even before she lost her mind, she was this really vicious person. And, you know, fire. We had in Bleak House the spontaneous human combustion, and fire is such an interesting thing. I talked about how I don't like movies where, you know, the house burns down at the end or everything explodes at the end, because it seems like in movies, at least, usually it's just such a cop-out. The writer doesn't know how to finish the script, so he or she has everything burned to the ground. And yeah, okay, that's convenient. But here, you know, we also have the sense that fire can be purifying. You know, it gets rid of people who, whether or not you consider them evil, are certainly a blight on humanity in what they're doing, or a blight on the people around them, I should say, in what they're doing to other people's lives. Mr. Crook is a negative and an evil character. Bertha Rochester, of course, is equivocal. You know, she has a brother who's still fond of her and still comes and visits her. She tries to kill him. You know, and if she's insane through an inherited disease, then obviously that is not her fault. But the fire certainly has a purification element if we look in sort of Jungian fashion as Mr. Rochester as being a person who has this anima, this female aspect of himself that's out of control and demented. Then, you know, he needs to be purified of that part of himself. And it happens with this fire and with Bertha's death. Although in all such cases, when a person takes on the prerogative of God, of life and death over somebody's life, well, there's a price to pay. And the price he pays is that he loses one arm and he loses his eyesight. The eyesight turns out to be temporary. He is redeemed by Jane Eyre at the end. But yeah, you know, the fire here has a certain sort of purification. It burns this gothic, gloomy house to the ground. In the Turn of the Screw, there's no fire, but yeah, I mean, similar themes, and yeah, certainly in Bleak House. Okay, and then we have an offstage death of Jane's uncle, who, when he dies, leaves her a fortune, so she's more or less the equivalent at that time of a millionaire. And that makes, you know, that pretty much that pretty much solves all her problems. Anyway, I am not going to go on to the Turn of the Screw, even though that's a short one, because I've spent all my time on Jane Eyre, but I think it was worth it. I enjoyed talking about that. So next time, you know, I was thinking, well, I was going to do The Plague and The Lord of the Flies, but now I'm thinking, well, let's do some other 19th century, early 20th century, 19th century works. Yeah, Wuthering Heights and Dracula that have a supernatural element. And the question is, with the Turn of the Screw being so short, do I dare try to do it with Dracula or with Wuthering Heights? Because both of those are really big. So maybe I need to find another short one to pair it with. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'm long-winded as always, and I hope I'm not giving you nightmares, and I'll see you next time. Bye.